By Jamie Eisenberg at Jamie Eisenberg, December 7, 2017. 37 minutes. Redmore Week 14 waiver wire, trade values, streaming options, rankings, stardom and sit-em, cheat sheet, sleepers, DFS values. Wow, when did Week 14 get here? It seems like just yesterday we were debating David Johnson versus Le'Veon Bell, waiting for an initial progress report on Andrew Luck's shoulder and trying to figure out who would be the best rookie running back this season. It goes by fast. This week is the start of the fantasy playoffs in the majority of leagues, and if you're reading this then you are probably alive in the postseason tournament. All your draft preparation, free agent moves and tough lineup decisions over the past 13 weeks have paid off in a big way. Congratulations! And now it's time to win the whole freaking thing. Your team is hopefully set with only a few lineup decisions to deal with, although injuries Joe Mixon and Zach Ertz, for example, and suspensions Rob Gronkowski and Juju Smith-Schuster could make for some tough choices. What did you expect winning in the playoffs to be easy? We'll do our best to steer you in the right direction. And hopefully I will be setting your lineup for at least one more time in Week 15. For now, we'll just wish you good luck. Because as much as skill and being a good fantasy player got you to this point, it will take a little bit of luck to win a championship. Headers note: projections are provided by CBS Sports and not Jamie Eisenberg. Start of the week: the Chargers looked like they were headed for a disastrous campaign when the 2017 season began. They lost their first 4 games, including 2 because of missed field goals, and some NFL pundits were questioning if Philip Rivers was done at 35 years old. Fast forward to Week 13, and the Chargers look like the best team in the AFC West. Although they are tied with the Chiefs and Raiders at 66, the Chargers have passed the eyeball test of late with their recent level of play. And a big reason has been Rivers. He comes into Week 14 against the Redskins averaging 343 passing yards in his past 3 games, with 6 touchdowns and no interceptions over that span. The Chargers are 30 in those games. Rivers is averaging 24.3 fantasy points in those outings against Buffalo, Dallas and Cleveland, and he's scored at least 19 points in 4 of his past 5 games. He's taken advantage of some plus matchups, and he should do the same thing this week against Washington. The Redskins are allowing an average of 19.5 fantasy points a game to opposing quarterbacks, and 3 of their past 5 opponents have scored at least 25 points, with 4 quarterbacks scoring at least 18. Rivers has played well at home this season, and he's averaging 20.8 fantasy points in his past 4 games in Los Angeles. And he should have another strong performance this week against the Redskins to help the Chargers in their quest to win the AFC West. For what it's worth, I expect the Chargers to win the division. And I expect Rivers to help fantasy owners win their playoff matchup this week. I'm starting Rivers over Carson Wentz at LAR, Russell Wilson at Jack, Jared Goff versus by Cam Newton versus Drew Brees at ATL. Quarterbacks sleepers: Jimmy Garoppolo at how the Texans allow the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and Garoppolo is worth using as a streaming option. He fared well in his first start for the 49ers at Chicago in Week 13 when he passed for 293 yards and completed 70.3% of his passes, along with an interception. He should have a better fantasy performance this week, and I like him as a low-end starting option in all formats. Josh McCown at Den. This might seem like a tough matchup against the Broncos, who are getting cornerback Aqib Talib back from his 1-game suspension last week at Miami, but Denver has allowed 4 of the past 5 opposing quarterbacks to score at least 20 fantasy points. McCown has 62 fantasy points combined against Carolina and Kansas City in the past 2 games, and this is now 7 games this year with at least 18 points. McCown is worth trusting in this game on the road. Blaine Gabbert versus 10. Gabbert had a rough game in Week 13 against the Rams, but that was an extremely difficult matchup compared to what he'll face this week against the Titans. Tennessee comes into Week 14 allowing 20.2 fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and 4 of their past 5 opponents have scored at least 18 points. Gabbert had at least 20 fantasy points in Week 11 at Houston and Week 12 against Jacksonville, and he is worth using as a starter in 2 quarterback leagues this week. Brett Hundley at Clee. Hundley let us down last week in a major way given his matchup with the Buccaneers at home, and he only scored 7 fantasy points. But he's still worth a look in 2 quarterback leagues this week with the matchup at Cleveland. The Browns have allowed an average of 20.3 fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks this season, and only Marcus Mariota in Week 7 and Blake Bortles in Week 11 failed to score at least 17 points against Cleveland this year. This is likely Hundley's last start this season, with Aaron Rodgers' collarbone expected to return in Week 15. Bust alert: Wilson being listed here does not mean sit him. I have him ranked no. 11, which makes him a starter in the majority of leagues. But I don't like him as much as Rivers, Dalton or Winston this week, among others. And I am nervous about the matchup against Jacksonville. While Wilson has scored at least 22 fantasy points in 7 games in a row and has put himself in the NFL MVP discussion, this will be his toughest matchup to date. The Jaguars allow the fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, giving up an average of 9.3 points a game to the position. Blaine Gabbert in Week 12 is the lone quarterback to score 20 fantasy points against Jacksonville, including matchups with Roethlisberger, Goff and Rivers this season. You can argue that Wilson is better than those guys, and I would agree, but this could be a letdown game for him on the road. Running back sleepers: Peyton Barber vs. Det. We'll see if Doug Martin concussion is able to play in Week 14 against Detroit, but it might not matter. The Buccaneers might make Barber the starter after his performance in Week 13 at Green Bay, when he had 23 carries for 102 yards and 4 catches for 41 yards on 4 targets. It was the first 100-yard rushing game for Tampa Bay this year, and he has a tremendous matchup against the Lions, who have allowed a running back to score in 10 games in a row. Giovanni Bernard vs. The Bears are banged up defensively, and Mixon will likely be out with a concussion. If Mixon plays, then don't plan on using Bernard, but he played great in Week 13 against Pittsburgh after Mixon got hurt, with 13 carries for 77 yards and 2 catches for 19 yards on 3 targets. Bernard has the chance to be a top 15 fantasy running back in all formats if Mixon is out this week. Frank Gore at BUF: The Bills' run defense has been awful since trading Marcel Darius to Jacksonville, and Gore should have the chance for a good game this week. In the past 5 games, Buffalo has allowed 970 total yards and 11 touchdowns to running backs, with 7 scoring double digits in fantasy points in a standard league over that span. Gore only has 1 game with double digits in fantasy points in a standard league in his past 9 outings, but this is a great week to trust him as at least a flex option. Bilal Powell at Den: One of the reasons I liked Drake last week was the Broncos' run defense, which has fallen apart of late and has key injuries along the defensive line. Denver has allowed 10 touchdowns to running backs in the past 5 games, and the Jets just got a good fantasy performance from Powell and Matt Forte in Week 13 against the Chiefs. Powell had 10 fantasy points in a standard league on 20 total touches, and Forte had 14 points on 18 touches. I like Powell better in standard leagues, and Forte is better in PPR. Both are strong flex options this week. Kerwin Williams vs. 10. If Adrian Peterson is out again this week, then Williams should be in line to start, and hopefully he'll perform like he did in Week 13 against the Rams. Williams had 16 carries for 97 yards, and he'll have the chance to be a flex option in Week 14 against the Titans. The workload should be there for Williams since the Cardinals have given their starting running back at least 15 touches in 5 games in a row. And the past 3 running backs against the Titans with at least 15 touches has scored a touchdown or gained 90 total yards. Bust alert: the Bears are struggling to run the ball lately, and losing right guard Kyle Longshoulder won't help matters. In 3 of their past 4 games, the Bears rushed for fewer than 65 yards, including Week 13 against San Francisco. And in the past 2 games for Howard, he has a total of 44 rushing yards on 20 carries. He's been a non-factor in the passing game lately, with 3 catches for 8 yards in his past 4 games. And the Bengals have only allowed 1 rushing touchdown in their past 3 games. Now, if linebacker Vontaze Burfict is out this week, then that will certainly help Howard, who should still be considered a low-end no.2 running back in the majority of leagues. But if Burfict plays, you should be concerned about Howard's production given his recent level of play, as well as Long being out. Wide receiver sleepers: Martavis Bryant vs. Val Bryant will start for the Steelers with Smith-Schuster out, and we just had this scenario in Week 12 when Smith-Schuster had a hamstring injury against the Packers in a primetime home game. Bryant had 4 catches for 40 yards and a touchdown against Green Bay on 6 targets, and he played well the last time he faced the Ravens when Jimmy Smith Achilles didn't play. It was 2014, and Bryant had 3 catches for 44 yards and 2 touchdowns, and we'd love to see a repeat of that performance in Week 14. Sammy Watkins vs. qualify in 2 games since Robert Woods' shoulder got hurt. Watkins has 7 catches for 120 yards and 2 touchdowns on 13 targets. Woods isn't expected to play this week, so Watkins has the chance to be a number 2 fantasy receiver in the majority of leagues. Watkins also has a touchdown in 4 of his past 5 games, so after a slow start he's finally starting to deliver for fantasy owners, especially since Woods went down. Nelson Agholor at LAR with Ertz not expected to play. This should be a good spot for Agholor to help fantasy owners. He's scored in each of his past 2 games against Chicago and Seattle, and he has 10 catches for 173 yards and 2 touchdowns on 18 targets over that span. He now has a touchdown in 5 of 6 games when he has at least 5 targets, and his targets should be up if Ertz sits because of his concussion. Kenny Stills vs. Stills didn't slow down in Week 13 against Denver even though Jay Cutler was back under center in place of Matt Moore. He had 5 catches for 98 yards and a touchdown on 13 targets, and he's clearly ahead of Devontae Parker as the No. 2 receiver behind Jarvis Landry. Stills has at least 13 fantasy points in 2 of his past 3 games, and the one-down performance was at New England in Week 12 when he only had 3 catches for 47 yards on 6 targets. But he scored in his previous 2 games against the Patriots, and he should be considered a No. 3 fantasy receiver this week. Jermaine Kearse at Den. Kearse has played great of late, and hopefully he will keep it going for another week at Denver. He comes into Week 14 with 16 catches for 262 yards and a touchdown on 21 targets in his past 2 games against Carolina and Kansas City, and he and Robbie Anderson have formed a formidable tandem. Kearse is worth using as a number 3 fantasy receiver this week, and the Broncos have allowed 4 touchdowns to receivers in their past 3 games. Bust alert: Funchess has been awesome since the Panthers traded Kelvin Benjamin to the Bills. In his past 4 games, Funchess has 21 catches for 346 yards and 3 touchdowns on 33 targets, and he's clearly been the number 1 receiver for Newton. Greg Olsen Foot is expected to return this week, which should take away targets from Funchess, and he has a brutal matchup against the Vikings. Only 5 receivers have scored double digits in fantasy points in a standard league against Minnesota, and Funchess will likely see plenty of standout cornerback Xavier Rhodes. Consider Funchess just a No. 3 fantasy receiver in the majority of leagues this week. Tight ends sleepers: Jason Witten at NYG. Witten has a great track record against the Giants, and they have been awful against opposing tight ends all season. He comes into this matchup with 3 touchdowns against the Giants in his past 5 meetings, including 7 catches for 59 yards and a touchdown on 9 targets in Week 1. The Giants haven't allowed the tight end to score or go over 100 receiving yards in 2 games in a row, but they were miserable against tight ends for the first 10 games of the year. Ricky Seals-Jones vs. 10. Seals-Jones saw his 2-game scoring streak end in Week 13 against the Rams when he finished with just 2 catches for 44 yards on 5 targets. But still got at least 5 targets for the 3rd game in a row, and he has a favorable matchup in Week 14 against Tennessee. The Titans have allowed a tight end to score or gain 90 receiving yards in 3 games in a row, and you can feel confident starting Seals-Jones in the majority of leagues this week. Austin Seferian-Jenkins at Den. Seferian-Jenkins is due for a good game after struggling the past few weeks, and the matchup against the Broncos should help. Denver allows the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends, and a tight end has scored against the Broncos in 5 of their past 6 games. Seferian-Jenkins hasn't scored since Week 7, and he only has 1 game with more than 2 fantasy points in his past 5 outings. But the matchup against Denver should give you confidence to trust Seferian-Jenkins in Week 14. Bust alert: Cook is the lone tight end to have success against the Chiefs this year, and we'll see if he can do it again in the rematch in Week 14. He went off for 6 catches for 107 yards on 7 targets against Kansas City in Week 7, and he's the lone tight end with double digits in fantasy points in a standard league against the Chiefs. Kansas City has also allowed just 1 touchdown to a tight end this year. It will be hard to trust Cook this week since he has 3 fantasy points combined in a standard league in his past 3 games against New England, Denver and the Giants, and those last 2 matchups are as good as it gets for a tight end. I would only start Cook in deeper leagues this week. Defensive special teams stardom: Patriots at MIA 13.7 projected points. You knew, despite a slow start, that the Patriots defense would turn things around as the season went on. And here we are, in December, and New England's defense has quietly been among the best in the NFL. The Patriots haven't allowed an opponent to score more than 17 points since Week 5, and they've held two teams, Oakland in Week 11 and Buffalo in Week 13, to fewer than 10 points in their past 3 games. The Patriots DST comes into this matchup at Miami with at least 11 fantasy points in 4 games in a row, including 17 points against the Dolphins in Week 12 when they had 7 sacks, 2 interceptions and a fumble recovery with Matt Moore under center. It won't change much against Jay Cutler, and Miami has allowed the past 3 opposing DSTs to score at least 14 fantasy points. Sleepers Jets at 10. The Jets don't have a great defense, and the Jets DST has 1 game with double digits in fantasy points in their past 7 games. But the Broncos don't have a good offense and come into this matchup with an interception streak of 8 games in a row. They have allowed 11 sacks in their past 3 games, and Denver has scored more than 20 points just once since Week 2. This is a great week to gamble on the Jets DST. Bengals vs. Chiefs. Cincinnati has a handful of players banged up on defense, but that shouldn't matter against the Bears at home. Chicago comes into this game having allowed the opposing DST to score 54 fantasy points in the past 3 road games, and the Bears have allowed the Eagles DST and the 49ers DST to combine for 36 points in the past 2 games. We hope the Bengals are 100% healthy on defense this week, but even at less than 100% they should perform well against the Bears. Bills vs. Giants. The Bills DST has struggled of late with only 1 game with double digits in fantasy points in their past 5 outings. But has been better at home this year than on the road with at least 11 fantasy points in 3 of 6 games, and 2 of their failures came against New Orleans and New England. The Colts come into this game allowing the most fantasy points to opposing DSTs this year, and 6 DSTs in a row have scored at least 11 points against them. Packers at Glee. The Packers DST has played well of late and had a good showing in Week 13 against Tampa Bay. The Packers DST scored a touchdown, had 7 sacks and recovered a fumble, and has now scored at least 10 fantasy points in 3 of the past 4 games. The Browns have allowed the opposing DST to score at least 13 fantasy points in 6 of their past 7 games, and this should be a good week for the Packers DST to reward your fantasy team. Eagles at LAR. 11.1 projected points. The Eagles DST has been great this year, and a big reason the team is dominating the NFC East. But the defense struggled last week at Seattle with no turnovers and just 2 sacks, and this should be another down performance at the Rams. The Rams have only allowed 1 opposing DST in their last 6 games to score double digits in fantasy points, which was Minnesota in Week 11. Jared Goff has just 6 interceptions on the season, and he's only been sacked 20 times. The Rams also score an average of 30.1 points per game. This is a good week to avoid the Eagles DST. Kickers start. Coons had a great debut with the Chargers in Week 13 against the Browns. He made 4 of 5 field goals and 1 extra point, and he was among the best fantasy kickers last week. Hopefully the encore will be just as successful against the Redskins, who have allowed 6 kickers to make multiple field goals this season. The Chargers' offense is playing great right now, and Nick Novak, who Coons replaced because of a back injury, also made 4 field goals in Week 11 against Buffalo. Sleepers. Dan Bailey at NYG. The Cowboys' offense got back on track in Week 13 against Washington, and Bailey had 1 field goal and 5 extra points. Dallas should again be able to move the ball against the Giants this week, and New York is among the league leaders in fantasy points allowed to kickers. 7 kickers have made multiple field goals against the Giants this year, including Bailey in Week 1 when he scored 13 fantasy points. Randy Bullock vs. G. Kickers have been exceptional against the Bears of late, and Bullock will hopefully follow suit. In the past 5 games, Chicago has allowed 13 field goals on 14 attempts, along with 11 extra points. Bullock also has done a nice job of late with 5 field goals and 5 extra points in his past 2 games for a combined 20.